Okay, so welcome to our workshop. I hope you had a good break and that you're really fresh for the fourth workshop. I know it's hard, so we're going to try to make it friendly as possible. So today we're going to discuss one-time customers, and this topic is actually really interesting because as marketers, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it, we invest a lot and we put a lot of effort into acquisition. And we try really hard to create this beautiful content, to be unique, to be creative, to engage with communities, and to give the customers the best experience we can give them. And then we get customers who buy once, which is great, but never come back. And this is very sad. And that's what we're going to discuss today. Before we start, I'm going to present ourselves. I'm Daphne. I'm the marketing manager at Optiv in New York of the North American market. And here with me is Agat, and she's our director of new business, straight from New York as well, or friends, depends. So let's start. So 59% of first-time customers never come back. And as a spoiler, this number can even get higher, and it does get higher in some industries. For example, in e-com and fashion, it can get even up to 70 or 80%, which is kind of crazy if you think about not only the amount of time and effort you spend into acquisition, but also about the money you spent into acquisition. And acquisition costs are rising all the time, and they're like 3 or 4 times higher than the cost of retaining an old customer. So we have here a real incentive to be more mindful about the type of customer I'm acquiring, who am I bringing in, and most importantly, what's next? What do I do once they're already there? What do I do after they purchased for the first time or made a first deposit, if we're talking about gaming customers? And so what do I do next? How do I make them buy for the second time or make a second deposit? And why am I talking about that second deposit or second purchase and not about generally repeat rates? The reason is because second purchase rate or second deposit rate is by far the biggest hurdles for marketers to overcome. It is much harder to get a customer to buy for the second time or make a second deposit. It is very hard, but once they're already there and bought for the second time or made the second transaction, it becomes easier and easier. So as you can see in the graph behind me, only 41% of the customers make it to the second transaction. But after that, after they're already in and bought twice or had 2 deposits, it becomes easier and easier over time. So how should we approach one-timers? So Agat and I built this session kind of to be a DIY session. So it's meant to be very practical, and this is something you can definitely implement on your own with your team once you're back at your offices. So the first thing to do is look at the data and understand how much time on average does it take to your customers to make that second transaction. And I'm saying your customers because this number is different across the board, and it can be for one company it can be a week, and for the other it can be 3 months, and for a different company it can be a year or 9 months. So this number varies and it's different, but it's fundamentally for a business, it is really important to understand that timeline if you want to maximize the chances of your customers coming back and making that second transaction. So once you understand that timeline and you really understand what's the average time does it take to your customer to come back and make that second transaction, you can define the lifecycle stages and you can understand when is a customer a new customer, and this is a customer that is in this timeline and will hopefully make a second transaction, and when a customer becomes one-timer. And a one-time customer is what we're trying to avoid. And a customer becomes a one-timer customer once he exits that timeline that we discussed about. Once he exits that timeline of the average time that it usually takes to a customer in your company to make that second transaction, once he exits that timeline, he becomes a one-timer. And we want to avoid it. And why? Because once he becomes a one-timer and exit that timeline, it will be much harder to get him to come back, or she, and it will be much more expensive. So we talked about that timeline, and once we understand that timeline, let's say it's 30 days for your company. So it is important to understand that in this threshold, it's exactly at this point. There is a threshold, and it's important to understand when they're becoming at risk of becoming one-timers. And this is something you just need to decide. It can be if it's 30, if your window is 30 days, it can be day 20, it can be day 25, it can be day 28 or 29. But it's something that is very approximate and very close to that end of timeline. And in that window, when the customers are at when the customers are at risk of becoming one-timers, we try to capture them all and automate campaigns that will help us to make them buy for the second time or make a second deposit. So this timeline, we're going to talk in this session about this timeline, and particularly about this timeline. And this is the time we want to capture them all and help them to make that second transaction and pass that hurdle that we talked about. So here's an example of something we did with one of our clients, and I know it kind of like looks intimidating. I'll explain. This is something we did with one of our retail clients, but it's the same idea, and it's very relevant to all of our clients, gaming and retail as one. So what we did here is to try to understand where do most customers fall in terms of making that second transaction. So all the numbers that you see here for this specific company is customers who already bought for the second time. So when we look at this graph and we see this orange line, which is accumulative, so we see that 15% of the customers who bought for the second time made that second purchase after 1 week. And then 23% of the customers who bought for the second time made the second purchase, after 2 weeks. And so on. And then we see that after 3 months, 70% of the customers bought for the second time. And what it means is that for this specific company in particular, 70% of the customers, most customers, made their second purchase within 90 days. So for this company, the timeline is 90 days, 3 months. And once we understand that timeline and when a customer becomes at risk of becoming a one-timer, we, as I said, want to capture them all and target them and automate campaigns. But how do we do it? So the first thing, before I hand the microphone over to Agat, is to note that not all one-timers are the same. And what do I mean? I mean that because they're all at a risk of becoming one-timers, it is not a good enough reason to batch and blast them and send them all the same message just because they're all at risk of becoming one-timers. It is really important to understand who is standing in front of you, who is the customer, and approach them differently according to what makes each one of them tick. And it can be different reasons and different things. And I'm going to hand over the microphone to Agat right now, which will and she will get more practical and discuss with you about her tips and best practices.
All right. So once we have the window of risk, right, we'll have a good understanding of when do we need to interact in order to minimize the chances or the risk actually of customers to not come back, right? So we have that understanding, whether that window of risk is day 75 out of 90 or day 15 out of 20, we'll have to find that out for your own company. Now, what we're going to go into now is more of a DIY, do-it-yourself DIY. Do-it-yourself session. And so what we've done here is just find ways of segmenting your one-time or risk of being one-time customers in a way that makes sense for your business. Now, because I'm guessing that you all come from very different businesses, or even if you come from within the same industry, different types of customer base, we're going to look at ways of segmenting that across the board are meaningful. What do I mean by meaningful? Segmentation is a buzzword, right? So there's a really kind of bad habit in the marketing space, which is to just take segmentation as the idea that, you know, trumps them all and just segment for the sake of it. There's a billion ways of segmenting in a way that's completely meaningless, right? Recency of transaction for some business has absolutely no impact on customers' future behavior. So the ways that we want to group customers are ways that make sense for your business, that we've found through your data will move your customers and elicit the similar reactions. So we've picked 4: day of the week, time of day, order amount, and product categories, and we'll go through them. I'll switch this. Okay, so the first one that we'll look at is day of the week. So this is all coming from Optimove customer data. Can you guys maybe show me by a show of hands how many of you guys are working with or in the gaming industry? Okay, and anybody else in e-commerce, retail, or anything else? Okay, that's Boris, and that's it. Cool. So we'll adjust. So this is all Optimove data. The first thing that we'll look at is day of the week. Thankfully, all of this really applies across the board, and it's coming mostly from our strategic services branch. So we have a graph here, and what we've done is trying to find a correlation between when people first transact and then have their second transaction, right? So vertically, you have the day of the week of the first transaction. Horizontally, you have the day of the week of the second transaction. And what you can see is that there is a very, very, very strong correlation, right? People are creatures of habit. If I tend to play on a Sunday night, that's probably going to be my behavior and my pattern, right, with variances. If I tend to shop on a Tuesday evening when I come back from work for whatever reason, I'm probably going to do this on first and second order. So what does it mean? It means that we need to be consistent within that window of risk that we've already talked about. We need to be consistent about how to address customers and when to do so, right? The thing that we shouldn't be doing, right, is probably set up 7 different campaigns per day of the week, right? That's probably not the most efficient, emotionally intelligent way of doing that. It's probably going to take a lot of time for your marketing team. So typically what a lot of people do with that is that they have one large automation that is picking up on a multiple of 7 starting from the day of first purchase, in which case you will have that second email or communication that will fall on the correct day of the week, regardless of what that was for that same person, right? So that's one of the tricks for implementing this. But that correlation is true across the board. The second one is time of day, right? So in that same way, this is not rocket science, and it's not, you're not going to drop off your chair in surprise that there's a correlation there. But, right, so here we have a similar, actually it's a different customer, and we've done a similar analysis, time ranges of transactions for the first transaction, time ranges of the second transactions. Here you have that same correlation, but here you have an additional level of difficulty, which is, unlike the day of the week, for the time of day, you actually need to time it a little bit earlier when they would typically come back and play or come back and shop, right? We actually, I don't know how many of you, if any, were here last year, but we had the CMO of Dollar Shave Club who came to speak on stage, and Dollar Shave Club is a subscription e-com business in the US, and she said something like, if a customer is giving me their email address, it's like a friend is giving you a key to their house for you to come visit. If you come to the house at 3 a.m. and you wake up the kids and the dogs start barking, nobody wants you, right? Marketing is a little bit the same thing, and the timing of the email is one very good way of applying that principle. Third one is order amount. So this is interesting because it looks the same, but actually it's less intuitive. Okay, so this is a third brand, and this is an e-commerce brand, and we've actually grouped, first order and first transaction by the order, like the average order value baskets, right? And same thing for the second order, second transaction horizontally. Here you see that same correlation, right? What am I saying? I'm saying that people who spend $100 on their first transaction will most likely spend within that range on their second. It's counterintuitive because a lot of the time you have marketers thinking, okay, I put in a lot of money to acquire those customers, I have my foot in the door, second order is the time for me to try to upsell you and cross-sell you into higher spend so that I can make my money back, right? It doesn't work. Not for second order. It's too high a risk to take. A lot of the time there is an expectation that you will target customers or whoever your clients with something within the similar range, which means that also typically, so in the retail space, for example, this habit sometimes of I bought a blazer, and the marketer will have recommendations within that same categories, but sometimes much higher price range also doesn't work, right? So there's a lot of reason to be mindful about this. And another fun fact, which is, I don't know if it's a fun fact, it's at least interesting, is that of course there's a very high correlation between the volume and the spend of the first order and the future value of those customers within the next 12 months, right? So you want obviously to get that ticket price up, but you want to be mindful as to what you're making of it afterwards. Okay. Fourth one is product category. Okay, so this is a little bit meatier, so I'll walk through it with you. So this is an e-com customer of Optimove who, that light is not getting better. It's an e-com customer of Optimove who sells luxury children's clothes, right? So we've run an analysis, and again, surprise, but it works the same in gaming. We've broken them by categories of first purchase, and horizontally here you have the spends, so how much they spend on their first order. Vertically you have the probability of them to not come back, right? So the higher you are up on here, the less likely you are to come back for a second purchase. So what is it that we're talking about here? We're going to be talking about how can I engineer my acquisition efforts to ensure to the maximum probability that I'm generating customers who will be more likely to come back, right? A lot of the work is done before you need to actually email people to make them come back, okay? So if you're looking at the bottom large circle, you have one category of first purchase, which is girls, right? So purchase from girls apparel. And what I'm seeing here is that it's a category that has pretty high spend and also very low chances of people not coming back or high chances of returns, right? So if you run an analysis with your own categories and your own products, it will tell you some really, really good information. For example, everything that's at the bottom, right, in the bottom two quadrants are excellent categories to recommend for acquisition, right? Because I will be generating people who come back, right? So of course, the higher the better, but those and anything that would be here would still actually be a better product category to recommend for your acquisition effort than anything that is on the higher quadrants. It doesn't mean that we're dismissing everything that's up there. It only means not now, right? Third purchase, fourth order, fourth transactions, whatever, but just don't play around with recommending categories that generate one-timers, right? So that's one example about how can I control it before, okay? And then second product category, number 2, I'd say. So this is the same brand, and we've split up the categories of first order and second order, so similarly to what we've seen so far. And what we've tried to find here is very simply correlations, right? We're trying to identify what are commonly commonly walked paths by customers from one categories, what are the categories in between which they travel from first to second. Why? Because I want to know what to recommend, right? We have the window of time for intervention, I have the day of the week, I have the time of the day, I have a very strong idea as to how much, what's the ballpark average spend that I'm gaming for, right? And now we're saying, okay, what do I recommend, okay? And so here you can see highlighted, right, you have some high correlations between, I don't know, like baby accessories and baby apparel, right? Or adult sleep and women clothing, right? So here you have this path that obviously you don't want to take a risk, so these are probably the best ones to recommend. On the other hand, everything here that's nothing are paths that nobody ever walked before. So it's up to you if you want to take the risk, but maybe not at that crucial time, right? And so I think what we were talking about earlier is that segmentation is really, really idiosyncratic, right? It's unique to your brands. We've just looked at 4 that across the board by a very large probability, there will be a correlation for all of your business between the 4 things that we've just looked at and the likelihood of people to come back. But it could be really anything else, right? So I have different examples, but beyond that, it could be, have they reviewed? Did they call customer service? What was the level of, are they part of their loyalty program? Were they recommending to your brands? Like, did they click on the site so many times before their first transaction? I don't know, right? We just need to find out. It's unique per data set. I'll just go very quickly through those 3 ones. So returns is more relevant to the e-commerce world, but I think that a lot of retailers are trying to avoid actively returns, right? Or they see it as something that could potentially negative, and eats a lot of margin, and you have to pay for shipping, etc. We have found out for a lot of our customers that people making their first transaction with a partial return, so they return part of their order, actually was often correlated to VIP customers in the next, in the future months, right? So it's actually, it doesn't mean that there's a causation, it doesn't mean that you should be trying to make your customers return. It just means that if you have a subset of customers who have partial return on first order, those guys you should probably set aside as a sub-segment, time allowing. The second one is basket variety. So if you forget about the basket idea, this is applicable very much so to the whole gaming world and really to pretty much any business. As a rule, the more varied and the most cross-sectional the initial basket and purchase is, the most likely your customers will be to spend more and to come back, right? So there's a lot of things that we can talk about maybe later as to kind of how can I encourage that cross transaction, right? Which is recommending things at checkout and things like this. But this is something to keep in mind. The third one is really important, and this is applicable for gaming, for e-commerce, for financial, for anything. First purchase discounts. The way that you're utilizing promotion should be very, very different for your first orders and your second orders and for everything after that. A good example of that is high discounts, right? High discounts are probably really good for your loyal customers sometimes. It creates a very different type of behavior for acquisition, right? Acquiring customers or new gamers on high discounts creates a lot of cherry pickers, right? You might attract people who are there only for the discounts, right? It's encouraging a behavior. It's not going to look or be the same thing for from the third transaction onwards, but for those early stages, it can be dangerous. On the other hand, if you think about anyone who purchased first with no discount at all, that's something else, right? It's either an impulsive buy or something that's really need-based, and so those people could also be treated differently. In the middle, we have everything else, and I'll give you an example from an Optimove client who wanted to look at first purchase category, first purchase discounts, and so we segmented and we looked at their customers who made their first order with no discount at all, 5% discount, 15% plus, and 20% plus, right? It turned out that people who made their first order with the 5% discount, so the lower level of discount, spent 20% more over the next year than anybody else, including the customers who had first purchase at no discount. Yeah, that's the surprising fact, right? It's not that intuitive, right? So there's a lot of value in looking at those other ways of segmenting. That's my point. I'll leave you with that and hand it back.
Thank you, Agathe. So to summarize, we talked about that timeline and how important it is to understand when a customer is a new customer, when a customer is a one-timer, and when he or she are at risk of becoming one-timers. And then, as Agathe explained, if you really want to declare war on your one-timers, it's very important to understand and be mindful and to pay attention to that correlation between the hours and days of when a customer is making a first purchase or a first transaction to when they're making that second transaction. And same goes for order value or deposit value, and it's really important also to remember that that product category is something that to be mindful when you're already when you're trying to acquire customers and not once they're in. To be very mindful about that. And the last thing and the last tip we want to give you today is test. And when I say test, I mean test the behavior of customer who already made that second transaction. And why is that? Is because when you understand their behavior and analyze it, you can really kind of reverse engineer it and see what worked and what didn't work. And once you fully understand that and you implement it on your new customers, you'd be able to maximize the chances of them coming back. So that's it for today. We hope you enjoyed it and that it was helpful and productive for you. And we're happy to answer any question you might have.